While engaged in its conflict with Russia, Ukraine has recently launched a massive anti-corruption campaign, with a number of senior officials being dismissed. Is victory for Ukraine possible as it deals with both external threats and internal problems? What are the realistic scenarios to resolve this crisis? In this dialogue special, Ukraine Crisis 1 Year On, we talked to Petro Burkovskiy, Executive Director of the Democratic Initiatives Foundation, and Vladimir Golstein, Chair of the Department of Slavic Studies at Brown University. Thank you, Petro. Thank you for accepting our interview. Of course, there's talk or in the media, they raised this kind of concern with some upcoming election, for example, in the United States or in some European countries. The support to the Ukrainians might be not that consistent, if not reduced. For example, if there's a Republican president in the US, is that a concern you also have?
Yes, we held this discussion inside Ukraine, and just for you to know, in December last year, we as an organization conducted a nationwide poll among the people who still live in Ukraine, and we asked a provocative question. So, what actions of the Ukrainian government would you support if the Western governments would reduce or even stop completely delivering the economic and military aid? And for you to know that 50%, the majority said that the Ukrainian government should continue fighting despite all of this. And another 15% said that the Ukraine should do everything to freeze the conflict, but not accept the Russian demands. So majority, the strong majority of the Ukrainian society says that even if this Western aid is reduced, the fight should continue because we are fighting for our existence and sovereignty. And another point on this issue is that, yes, I think our diplomacy is concerned, and our diplomats right now are starting talks with the Republican Party in order to contain Trumpists, right, and to appeal to the constructive wing and the pro-democratic wing of the Republican Party in order still have a pro-Ukrainian majority, at least not pro-Ukrainian, but a majority in US Congress which supports Ukraine despite the partisan divisions.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point there. Of course, since it's the first year anniversary of the conflict, so there's a lot of talk, what's the end game of this war? And, some people would say, oh, we need probably neutrality of Ukraine. But you argue that NATO membership is important, just like, I guess Sweden and other countries did. They applied to join NATO because with NATO's nuclear umbrella, that's probably a good deterrent against any possible or potential military action from Russia. Tell us more about that.
Well, you see, first, I think that your audience should know that in 2014, when Russia first attacked Ukraine and seized Crimea, Ukraine was a neutral country, and the principles of neutrality were inscripted into the national legislation. That was a part of the national law. And regardless to this, and regardless to the position of Ukraine toward Russia, that Ukraine is neutral and Ukraine is not going to enter NATO, Russia attacked. Another fact, very interesting, and Russians did know this, that before 2014, only 13% of Ukrainians wanted to join NATO. So it is also according to our opinion poll. But when Russia attacked, when Russia ruined the principles of peaceful bilateral relations, people suddenly and very sharply moved in the different direction. So just for you to understand, in May 2014, almost 33% of Ukrainians think that Ukraine should join NATO. And in September 2014, after the Donbass invasion and very heavy fighting in Donbass and Ilovaisk encirclement, when Russian forces encircled Ukrainian forces, the support for NATO increased to 46%, and it never dropped. And in 2021, the support for NATO reached the unprecedented, historically high 54%. So, meaning the point is that Russia, by its own actions, pushed Ukrainian towards NATO. So, before Russian invasion, Ukrainians were hesitant toward NATO. Most Ukrainians wanted to stay neutral. And Russians did knew this. And moreover, you also know, and your audience know, that Germany and France were against Ukraine joining NATO. But 2014 changed everything. And in 2022, after February invasion to Ukraine, 74% of Ukrainians think that only NATO membership will guarantee security in the future. And all of the major European powers also are backing right now the future membership of Ukraine. That was also confirmed during the Madrid summit in 2022. So it appears that Russia, with its aggression, made Ukrainians want to join NATO. That was a result of the Russian policy.
Mm-hmm. But the issue is like, there are conditions to join NATO, to become a NATO member. For example, one of the conditions is free from conflicts from with your neighbor or with other countries. But as the war in the eastern part of the country continues and there's no end in sight, that will be a long-term, let's say, application probably or pursuit to join NATO.
I think it's possible, but I also think it's possible that NATO membership of Ukraine can be a part of the future peace arrangement. When we speak about the NATO, right, there is inside Russia there is an understanding or perception of NATO as an aggressive bloc which can attack Russia. But if we are speaking in the real world conditions, can you imagine a world where a nuclear power is attacked? Or anybody would decide to attack a nuclear power? No, nobody would attack a nuclear power because he will be, or this country will be afraid of a nuclear reprisal. So Russia has a nuclear arms, and this is the best and the ultimate guarantee for their security and sovereignty. And that means that if Ukraine joins NATO, it won't attack Russia, and NATO is not going to attack Russia. Mm-hmm. And therefore, Ukraine will stay independent, sovereign, and protected by the nuclear weapons of the United States, Britain, and France. And Russia will be protected by its own nuclear weapons. So I think that could be a basis for the achievable and relevant peace agreement between NATO and Russia.
With that being said, there are some realists, probably we can call them, or you can see they are cynical, including some of the scholars from the US or former officials of the US. They talked about the impossibility, for example, for Russia to give up on Crimea or some of the land probably in the eastern part of this country. I mean, then again, how realistic it is for Ukraine as a nation to ask probably, or to pursue a goal of driving the Russian forces out of the country entirely, including out of Crimea?
I think that my response to the realist would be also very realistic and in terms of political, realpolitik. So if the foreign army is eliminated, then nobody can stop the other army. So Russia can hold the Ukrainian lands only by the strength of its force. If the Russian army is defeated completely, if it breaks up, then the question, who will defend Crimea and what should we do? We can imagine that somebody will propose, maybe it can be China or some other great power, can propose in this moment, then Russian army breaks up and Ukrainian victory is imminent, to propose to put the peacekeeping forces somewhere between Ukraine and Crimea. But then it's up to Ukraine to decide whether it will accept this proposal and whether it's serious and whether this proposal is also accepted by Russia. So you see, it's very, even in terms of realism, it's very difficult to foresee the future. I think that ultimately the war will end with the victory of the either side. And that will, and after this, some kind of peace agreement would be made, if we speak on terms of political realism.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's turn to the domestic issues. President Zelensky and his government has launched this anti-corruption campaign. Tell us, probably people have this, sense or the impression it used to be very rampant in terms of corruption. Why now the anti-corruption campaign, and how big an issue is corruption in this country?
Yes, corruption was and is a big issue for Ukraine, because Ukraine entered the war in February 2022 when we only started the fight against corruption, when we only started, when the anti-corruption bodies like National Anti-Corruption Bureau, Special Anti-Corruption Prosecution Office, they only started to work. So, and it's very difficult for these bodies to continue their work properly. Moreover, a lot of energy and efforts of the government was concentrated and focused on repelling the Russian aggression. And during the war, during any war in the human history, you will find the people who try to make a profit on this. So Ukraine is not an exception. Russia also is not an exception, but we're speaking about Ukraine. So, and I think that there were people, and these people were exposed by the anti-corruption bodies and by the journalists. And do you know what was very different this time? So Zelensky reacted very quickly and very swiftly, and he fired several people, including a man from his very, very close circle. So Zelensky's message was that no one is untouchable during the war if he's even suspected of corruption. So this man should step aside, resign, and try to clear his name to defend himself in a good manner, but with no relations to power. So that was approach of Zelensky government. But it also showed that the Ukrainian government has an intention to fight, and this fight against corruption is supported by the people.
Mm-hmm. Well, to the people outside this country, of course, people think this country is entirely a battle zone. But when we were here, we found out that largely people are conducting the normal life despite the wailing of the sirens, right, of the missile or rockets attack. Tell us how people in this country are conducting their own lives under such a situation.
Sorry if I'm referring too much to the public opinion, but we also looked at what is the emotional background of the people, what are the major emotions people think when they think about themselves and when they think about the country. And despite the war and despite the missiles attack, because we also conducted polls before and after missiles attack, and what we have seen that the confidence has grown, the hope has grown, and anxiety a little bit decreased. So, and also increased the hope, confidence, and expectation for the better future. It means that there is a great, strong sense of unity, which help people build their future plans and live with their everyday lives. So yes, people are struggling with all the hardships. People are struggling with all the mental fatigue they have during all of these months. It was very, very hard for the people. But finally, they are very confident that the government will succeed and that the armed forces will succeed. So, and this helps people to be confident and hopeful in their everyday lives. So, and that actually makes that makes a great and that forms a great resilience of the Ukrainian people. So most of the society is ready to bear the cost of this war from day to day, because they believe that the future will be Ukrainian.
Mm-hmm. The future will be bright for the Ukrainian people.
Yes, for Ukrainian people, right.
Okay, that's all the questions I have for you. Thank you, Petro. Thank you for your insights and time.
Thank you very much.
Well, welcome to the show, Mr. Golstein. A year later since the war started, Russia and Ukraine are now more or less, getting stuck in the deadlock on the front line, east part of Ukraine. And meanwhile, more weapons are being provided from the West. So what do you make of the current stage, or what are the following stages of the war? Are we expecting to see a vital victory in the near future from either side?
Yeah, we are not going to see a real victory, or we have to define what the victory is. What we know for sure that a lot of people already died on both sides. Some estimations go almost like to 150,000 on each side and so on. That's a very serious losses. Russia cannot afford to lose this war. This is existential threat to them. They know if they, for some reason, lose it, the country might be split, the whole system will unravel, so they can escalate it at any time, in any way they want. So I don't think the West, by pumping more and more weapon into Ukraine, is doing anything except, prolonging this bloodshed. what Russia will try to achieve, and I think they are moving in this direction, despite all the losses, they would more or less liberate, as they declared, the eastern Ukraine, the area of Donbass. And from there, they would sort of make sure, threaten other cities, Kharkiv, Odessa, and to force Ukraine to sit and negotiate. And I think that's what will happen eventually, that Ukraine will negotiate, they will preserve the rest of the territory except Donbass and Lugansk regions, which are declared as already Russian territory, and they would probably remain neutral. I don't think Russia is interested in taking Kiev and changing the regime. I don't think they can do that, but they will definitely preserve the territory, which is Russian speaking, most of the people are Russians. It will be unbelievable a kind of blow to the system if they give up. So they cannot give up on eastern Ukraine, on Donbass region. So they will persevere until they get their goals.
But at the same time, we know that Ukraine, obviously, they are determined to drive the Russian forces out of their territory. Of course, there's strong support from European countries, from the US. They are aiming to, let's say, weaken Russia through the war, if not destroy the country completely. It seems like there's no sign of compromise from either side. Do you still think the end game would be, like a ceasefire, probably, with loss for Ukraine, loss of territory in the eastern part?
I think what is going on all around the world is that practically every country is in a state of denial. United States denies the fact that they are no longer one single hegemonical power. They just cannot deal with it. They cannot recognize that there is China, there is India, there is Russia. They want to dominate and continue to dominate, and they will try to do that. Until they realize that they cannot do that, they will try to push Ukraine. Ukraine failed to realize, refuses to realize that people on the eastern Ukraine in Donbass don't want to live under Kiev. The same way, like Russians probably should be aware that people in the west of Ukraine, in Kiev, in Lviv, they don't want to live under Russia. They want to live under Kiev regime. So these are all complicated situations, and until the countries kind of realize that this is, and there is no one single victory. They have to make a compromise, and compromise is eastern Ukraine, Donbass region belongs to Russia because they're Russian speakers, and they, since 2014, they were fighting against Kiev regime. They're very much determined. They're not going to give up to Kiev. So until there is a new borders are there. And I think what I'm saying is that there were endless amount of polls and questions of people in eastern Ukraine, and they answer very honestly. They don't want to live under Kiev. So, and for Russia, they can't afford to say goodbye Donbass, because that will be a tremendous blow to Russian prestige. You just cannot give up. Every Russian have some relatives in Donbass region. They hear about them. So to betray your own people and say you go to Kiev where they're gonna prosecute you, put you to jail, it's impossible for Russia. So Russia will not give up eastern Ukraine. So once the countries realize their limited purposes, Donbass goes to Russia. Russia allows Ukraine to function any way they want, and West let this region decide for themselves rather than imposing their will. United States impose their will not only on Ukraine, also on EU. They tell EU what to do, and they just sooner or later it will stop.
Mm-hmm. Are we seeing any signs of fatigue in terms of the support from the EU countries or the US, to Ukraine? We know that in 2024 presidential election, there could be or might be a Republican president. A Republican in general shows less support, let's say, to Ukraine. Will that be a factor, for example, affecting the situation in the Ukraine war?
It's a complicated issue because what this situation reveals to the world, to a lot of people all over the world, that there is a big separation and big split between the politicians who don't feel any fatigue because they benefit from military-industrial complex, they benefit for wrapping themselves into banners and pretending to be heroes, and common people who realize that they are paying taxes, a lot of taxes for like a corrupt government in Kiev. It's a really corrupt government, and everybody knows that, including Ukrainians. They send their children, the leaders of Ukraine send their children abroad while common Ukrainians are fighting the war and dying in endless amount of numbers. So common people feel fatigue in Russia, in Ukraine, in the EU, and the United States. Whether these politicians decide to capitalize on this fatigue and say enough is enough, we hear some marginal politicians saying it. I don't see so far the mainstream politicians saying it's enough. But maybe by 2024, there will be enough pressure and Republican candidates will say that we don't want to waste our available resources on this. I also think that certain things will have to change in the mindset of European and American politicians. We have endless amount of problems facing the world, from climate to COVID to anything. We need cooperation rather than ostracizing, maligning, treating other countries as pariahs. So sooner or later, politicians will understand this drift too. Will it happen by 2024? I hope so, but it's not guaranteed. But fatigue will take over sooner or later.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier about European Union or European countries basically played a role somehow very much influenced by the United States. Tell us more about the role played by the European Union in terms of support or in terms of being affected by the war and also the sanctions, and the devastating effects basically on their own countries.
There is no unity in European Union. There is very serious divisions are there. Some countries are like very much in the pocket of United States. Unfortunately, Germany, which is like the most fundamental country in Europe, they are still following the American line. But we hear other countries from Slovakia to Hungary, they're not willing to sort of go along. They realize that they need cheap gas from Russia, they need cooperation, they need to trade. So I suspect that these divisions will only grow. Of course, there are countries like Poland who is very, very active, taking pro-American side and continues to push this line. But I think sooner or later, many countries will realize that Europe, the idea of EU is to be united, so they don't need the situation which divides them, which creates very radical parties on the continent, which makes life more expensive, which drives inflation up. So I think it will sooner or later it will stop. It become politically, now for time being, it's politically wise for politicians to follow American line because they know they depend a lot. But sooner or later, it will become a liability rather than advantage.
Rather than advantage. If you look at the global community at large, you see, sanctions being imposed on Russia, mostly by Western nations, the U.S., European countries, G7 probably. But if you look at the absolute majority of the international community, for example, African countries, Latin American countries, Asian countries, mostly developing world, including China, India, Brazil, South Africa, for example, they are not with the Western world in terms of imposing sanctions or criticizing Russia. What do you make of this kind of international situation?
I think this international situation knocks at the door of European politicians, and they tell them, we want trade. Basically, we know that's what Western politicians and economists and scholars keep on telling the world, that we benefit from trade, we benefit from cooperation, we benefit from working together toward common goals. why do we need these sanctions, which rise the prices? Why do we need this endless amount of wasting valuable resources on weapons, on new weapons? So this is not a productive way of spending money. And Africans understand very well they need cheap grain. Many other countries understand very well they need good access to energy. So they also see, being outside Europe, they see United States for what it is. They don't just get benefits. Many countries remember what English did to India. They remember what Western world did to Africa, to many other parts of the world. So they understand that this is a propaganda war as well. They understand that this is not, as the way it's presented in the West, good law-abiding Europe versus aggressive Russia. They see there's this one side pushes their interest, another side pushes their interest. So they say, okay, let them decide it. We don't want to interfere. We want to trade. We want a cooperation. We don't want to be part of that. So I think that's the situation.
Mm-hmm. Of course, when the war was started a year ago, basically for the West, European countries, the U.S., they would point a finger at Russia for invading, quote unquote, a sovereign nation in Ukraine here. And of course, for the Russian side, that they would blame the NATO expansion in the 5 rounds of expansion after the disintegration of the former Soviet Union. So what are the true reasons, the factors that played a role in reaching thinking to such a situation at a military conflict, basically?
Yeah, it is a very complex situation. And one scholar observed that the West started the war, but Russians started the invasion. In other words, there was endless amount of Western provocations, which, as you said, were basically expansion of NATO. There was already, when Russia withdrew, we have to look at the map and see how things unfold. From 1990, Russia was withdrawing its forces from the West. They were located in Germany, in Eastern Germany. They move away from Germany. They move away from Romania, Poland, Bulgaria area. They move away. Understanding was, agreement was, oral agreement. They were shaking their hands with Bush and Gorbachev, whatever. Leaders of Germany were saying, we wouldn't let NATO even on the eastern part of Germany. That's what they were promising Russians. And they push and push and push, and they surrender Russia with more military bases and more aggression. And Russians were saying again and again, it's a red line. Furthermore, Western thinkers, from George Kennan to Burns, who was a diplomat to Russia and head of CIA at the time, they were saying, we're pushing them too far. It's a red line. Let's not do that. But for some reason, very myopic, very aggressive, very kind of limited in their understanding politicians like Hillary Clinton and her State Department, they pushed this war until Russians probably lost their cool and started the invasion. And we're now here 1 year later. What I hope that we still, if you look at the United States, most of the politicians are still grounded. They're old. They're what they call boomer generation. They're generation of this post-war. They still think Cold War. They still think, United States is the only reliable, law-abiding country. The situation's changed. So younger people, younger politicians will probably learn to think differently. They learn to think both locally and globally, and they will sort of be ready to negotiate. And I know that when I talk to young people, both in Russia, Ukraine, United States, they are willing to look at the world differently, as opposed to very politicians who dig their heels and don't want to move.
Well, cooperation rather than confrontation. Thank you, Mr. Golstein. Thank you for your time and insights.